Len Materman is
Hey, Dennis.
coming up. He's the CEO of
God.
OneShoreline, which is a great name considering all the title before it. And once again, sorry for the for our lateness and schedule, but I think you have a lot of interesting things to tell us. And if I'm not sure if you have slides, if you want to take the screen,
I do, sure.
I will. Yeah, I'll just take off that share. That picture I had up was of you. I guess that's a bridge on the San Francisquito Creek, and you had a lot. Well, let's say you were working on that for quite a bit, and now you're going larger.
Yeah, I was working on San Francisquito for about almost a dozen years, and now we're working on this new new countywide agency. So I'll start a screen share, if that's all right,
Sure, I'll get out of the way.
and try to run through some slides. I know it's late. Thanks for including me, Dennis, in your program. So I'll try to run through these really quickly, and maybe if anybody has questions. So we focus on the impacts of climate change, the water-related impacts of climate change. And this is a graph that shows sea levels in the bay rising in the last 125 years at the pace of about 1 inch every 15 years. And the kind of middle of the road estimate for the rest of the century is maybe the green line, that it would go from about 1 inch every 15 years to 1 inch every 2 years, so considerably faster. And this creates obviously a lot of anxiety, not just on sea level rise, but on all the other issues of global warming, climate change. And so one of our most important things that we do is give people assurance that something's being done about it in San Mateo County. San Mateo County, they need that assurance. It's the most vulnerable county in California to the first 3 feet of sea level rise in terms of number of people, underrepresented population, property value, homes, contaminated sites. It's in the top 10 in the United States in terms of number of people affected. And in the Bay Area, not only does it have the most homes affected, it also, the median income in those homes that are affected is lower than the county median income. And so that's a real issue for our underserved populations. There was an acknowledgement that we have 12 cities along the Bay, and we have 2 cities, and well, technically 3, and lots of an incorporated county area on the Pacific Coast side. So this is a problem that no one city can address by itself. There had been a longstanding flood control district, but it only covered about 10% of the county. So there was a move to create this district to look holistically at the threats, looking at climate change as a major issue, looking holistically at the geography, crossing jurisdictional lines, and looking holistically at the objectives in terms of utilizing green infrastructure, making waterways, creeks, and the shoreline more of community assets than something that's walled off. Lots of projects. We were started just in January of 2020, so about a year and 8 months ago. And we have a lot of projects underway. The ones in blue are the ones that we're the lead agency on, including one at the bottom called Bayfront Canal and Atherton Channel at the intersection of Redwood City and Menlo Park along the bay. And that's under construction. Here's the area. It's at Marsh Road and Highway 101. Frequently flooded area with 5 mobile home parks, mostly in Redwood City, some of it in county area, and lots of jurisdictional issues there, as well as environmental issues. So it was a complicated project. It was in planning for years. It was handed over to us January of 2020. We put together the funding and got the permits over the finish line, and now it's under construction. I'll just show, here's a couple of pictures of the construction. Basically, we're taking fresh water from a canal that backs up during high tides. In fact, this image shows the tides the tide gate doesn't work effectively, and the tides are moving upstream, even though it's a rainy day. And so we're putting water underground into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service former salt ponds. We also are looking at regional projects. San Francisco International Airport has a big project to protect its shoreline. Part of that, they have an option to build a levee literally along the runway along Highway 101, very long stretch. They can avoid that if they tie into protection to the north and the south of the airport. And so that's why they're interested in what the cities to the north and south are doing. Meanwhile, in 2019, at the end of 2019, Burlingame put out a study on its vulnerability to sea level rise. And about 4 months later, in April of 2020, Millbrae did the same. These two cities are to the south of SFO. And so they came to us in 2020 and said, can you help to coordinate our activities rather than have three separate projects? It makes sense for all of us to be talking to each other and aligning our efforts. So this is what the footprint of the project looks like. It's about 1.5 miles shoreline and 1.5 miles of four creeks up to the train tracks, the Caltrain and BART tracks, and it connects into SFO. What we're sharing are objectives, assumptions, technical information, environmental mitigations, costs, and land rights. It's a big, complicated project. And fortunately, we received some money in the state budget that was recently signed for this project. Another effort, regional effort, also looking at different jurisdictions that are kind of had been and still are in some ways looking individually at their issues. This is Pillar Point Harbor area on the coast side of San Mateo County. And 1956, this image on the upper left shows kind of a nice Half Moon Bay. It's just north of the city of Half Moon Bay. This is the upper end by Mavericks Beach. And in 1959, these outer breakwaters were put in by the Federal Army Corps of Engineers. That obviously changed the wave patterns, as you can see in the image on the bottom left. It's caused erosion at Princeton, which is part of the county. It's caused erosion at Highway 1, which is a state asset, of course, and at Half Moon Bay State Beach, which is a state asset, affected parts of northern Half Moon Bay. And it protects the harbor district, the harbor there at Pillar Point, from wave action for sure. But it doesn't do anything for their sea level rise vulnerability long term. So our project is to take a holistic view at kind of solving all of these issues long term, rather than each of the entities, state, harbor district, county, federal, city, looking at it individually. And so we're starting a study on that shortly. The other thing that we're focused on this year is development and creating development zoning regulations and influencing the general plans and specific plans of cities to look towards the future. And cities, as you know, probably require development in the FEMA 100-year floodplain to build a certain way, but not yet considered our future conditions. And so we are working with several cities now in the county to incorporate future conditions into the earliest planning stages of new development and the approval process, the entitlement process. And the benefits of this are to the developer in terms of protecting their assets and establishing kind of a predictive approach to the approval of their plans. And it's advantageous to the cities and to us at OneShoreline to have the developer at the table working with us. And so this affects both zoning, general plans, specific plans, as I mentioned. The first city that is looking to put specific sea level rise requirements into their zoning is the city of Burlingame. And we had the city council had a meeting on this last week, Monday, and agreed to move forward quite enthusiastically. And so it's going to their planning commission in a couple of weeks with specific zoning language, which is great. It will be the first city to address this issue in zoning in the Bay Area. We're also working with specific developers in the county on what they need to do to get development approvals and incorporating future conditions into those approvals. And what we're trying to avoid are situations where new townhomes spring up right on the shoreline without any protection, because with sea level rise, you're forced to then retrofit the property and put walls in front of front doors and windows, and we're trying to avoid that situation. Our assumptions about sea level rise are substantial. This shows kind of the daily high tide along the bay shoreline of San Mateo County between 6 and 8 feet. FEMA 100 year is 10 to 11 feet. This is all relative to NAVD 1988. The FEMA 100 year in freeboard is 12 to 13 feet. And what we're working towards is 4 feet above that, which is 4 feet above the FEMA requirement, 6 feet above the FEMA 100 year, and in fact, 10 feet above today's daily high tide. So again, our interest is in removing people, not just from today's risk, but from future risks, and avoiding the costly and challenging effort to retrofit property later that's being developed now. And so includes public and private infrastructure and waterfront protection into new development. Also the building of marshes for their flood protection, environmental benefits, and it all should incorporate trails to be part of the Bay Trail or Creekside Trails, again, getting to that community asset. We're developing a dashboard for cities, starting with South San Francisco along Colma Creek. Here's that development shown earlier. And there's a pedestrian bridge a developer wants to put in. And so they're asking us, okay, how high do we build the bottom of that bridge, the soffit, to avoid flooding? And so our dashboard is looking at specific areas and future conditions, not just today's FEMA floodplain, and saying, okay, relative to NAVD 88, you should build at this location to this elevation. By the way, 43 feet doesn't mean it's the depth of the water during a flood. It just is the elevation for the bridge. So this dashboard, not surprisingly, it includes the FEMA flood zone, but then it goes beyond that to look at future conditions with sea level rise. It also, we're looking at, okay, how does the median income of residential areas match with those future conditions, and how might policymakers make decisions to help to address environmental justice issues? Or how does future development in the general plan, how does that relate to the future conditions of where development may be proposed for housing? And also to drill down into that housing and say, okay, well, what does the tree cover look like? Or what are other issues, trails in the area, et cetera. So that will conclude the presentation. Thank you very much. And Dennis, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, Len, thank you for that presentation. I mean, that fascinating, and just really the work you've been doing in just even the past year is pretty remarkable. And I know it's gotten a lot of accolades, so anyway, thanks very much for that. We want to really keep an eye on things. Just even this kind of looking into development, and then taking long looks at different patterns and tides and things. I mean, it's it's one of those things. If it didn't exist, we'd be talking about it needs to be invented. So anyway, thanks very much for that. And it's interesting though, just even in these different areas, as far as what what the possible flood effects are. I mean, there's some areas that are pretty obvious, but like for instance, that South San Francisco areas.
There's, I mean, the FEMA flood maps are pretty well established and understood. But what we're seeing already during king tides is water in areas that people don't really associate with water. And that's obviously just going to get worse. So like, for example, we're looking at a city that right now doesn't see water. They don't particularly see a particular issue to it. They're looking at a large development, and very large. And so we're showing them maps that say, okay, sea level rise, the first impacts of sea level rise will be in these specific spots according to LIDAR and the models. And so if you're going to start looking at it, we recommend these specific areas. And that was kind of new information to them to understand that, 10 years from now, things will look different than they do today. We're firm believers in that.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the holistic view. And in this case, I mean, it's something that's really needed, especially in terms of development. We don't want to build ourselves into boxes. And I know you had some of those pictures about, well, you don't want suddenly have berms in front doors. And I recognized those developments and wondered at the time, like, who thought of this?
Yeah.
And, Venice has already been built. I mean, you don't need to rebuild it. And
And Dennis, I just want to say, finally tying into some of the previous conversations, and I was online earlier. Most of our water treatment plants have real issues with this, and the vast majority of them do, and they're expensive solutions. And so in our county where we work, all of our projects that intersect with water treatment plants, that's a big issue. And for example, we were working closely with Teresa over at Silicon Valley Clean Water, because their site is in Redwood Shores, which is looking at being taken out or putting into the FEMA flood zone, where right now it isn't, because of the new maps that came out recently. So that doesn't take into account sea level rise. It's just current FEMA flood maps, but it's a real issue and it's something to think about.
Yeah, well, certainly even it gets into the discussion of distributed water treatment. Whoever's owns it or however it's done. I mean, there's a need for it for a number of reasons. And that's one of them. Anyway, thank you very much for your patience and your great presentation.
My pleasure.